What's up, guys? Yxloth here, and this is going to be something slightly unusual. I've been asked to classify gods by their power curves, as in which gods are early game, mid game, late game, which gods are consistent through all stages of the game, and that's what we're going to try and do. I figured the easiest way to do this is just use a tier list as a reference. This is not going to be a tier list by any means, but what we're doing is we're kind of repurposing it. So we have the area here up here for early game gods, then early to mid game gods in the third line, then 2 lines for mid-game gods, 1 line for mid-game to late game, and 2 lines for late game again. And then we have gods who are strong throughout all stages of the game. So I hope this is understandable. The first 2 lines for early, for example, or the 2 lines for middle are even in terms of how good they are. I just have no better way to separate this. So the first 2 lines here are strong early game gods, strong mid-game gods, and strong late game gods here. And the ones in between are like gods that are strong throughout both stages and transitioning there. No more talking around this. We're going to go through this relatively quick without talking too much about one particular god and just give them a general classification. So, we're beginning with Agni, and I have to look over there and check if I put them in the right place. Yes, the Agni is a mid-game god. I would nearly say a mid-game to late game god, but generally a mid-game god. He does do well in the late game with the team, but he needs a while to come online, and then he's very, very potent already. Amuzen is theoretically strong throughout all stages of the game. Keep in mind, this is not a tier list, so if he's a strong god or not doesn't really matter. His potential doesn't really change. He's strong in terms of boxing early and late game team fights. He's still decent. So, yeah, so much about that. Aposh also mostly a mid-game god, maybe a little more leaning towards the late game than Agni, but I will place him in mid-game as well. Anhur, an early to mid-game god. He falls off late game a little bit, but his early boxing potential is very good, and this goes on into middle. He dominates the whole laning phase, basically. Amaterasu, typical late game god, has all that late game damage that she needs, has all that CC, and really needs a while to come online. Anubis, once again, strong through all stages. Ao Kuang, the very definition of a late game god, can come online a little bit earlier though. If he gets ahead early on, not fed early on, but ahead early on, he will also be pretty dominant in mid-game already with the execute, so I would put him in between late and mid-game. Aphrodite, once again, very, very typical late-game god. And Apollo rather in the mid-lane section. Apollo doesn't really, like, he's decent in lane now, but he's not as strong as when Golden Bow was around, but yeah, he's got a bit of both. Arachne is the epitome of an early game god, with some tendencies to go strong into mid game as well, but her level 1 bully potential is really where she shines. Ares is more towards mid-late game. He has some very early aggression as well, so overall I would put him in strong throughout all phases, because if he dominates the lane, even though he doesn't have the best clear, that's an advantage for him. At the same sense, team fights with Ares are really, really strong. Artemis, obvious case for late game, no doubt about that. That's where she is strongest. Athena, not so much late game. I would put her between early and mid game. Her taunt is very potent early on. She's got early lane aggression, and she's got those teleports that help her go wherever. Awilish, once again, very much focused on early aggression. Bacchus. Now, Bacchus is good in lane, but also very good in late game team fights, so I will give him all stages. Bakasura, clearly more towards the late game, the longer, but with the little note that he's also very good in mid game, and very late game he falls off again. So maybe between mid and late game again. Bastet should be the very definition of mid game god mostly. She shines after she's getting her cats, after she's got some level, some pen and stuff like that, after she can reliably start to split push and all that stuff. That's where she is best. Can put her here just to keep it mixed up a little bit. Bellona, once again, one of those gods that is very good in lane, but also doesn't really fall off much. So, all stages. Cabrakan, mostly an early game god in earlier times when he was played in jungle, and he's still got that early aggression, but in the solo lane now, he's not that much of an aggressor anymore. He's more towards mid-game setup. His late game is generally not the best, so I will put him between early and mid game. Chuck. Chuck is strong early, okay mid, and weak late, so I will put him in the early game category. Chang'e is quite the opposite down here with Afro. She's very much looking for the late game. Chiron is mostly solid mid game character. He does have decent early. He doesn't really get bullied off lane, but he does not have Anhur levels either. So bit of both. Kronos very very much late game, hyper carry in every sense of the way. Though he does come online a little earlier than, for example, Artemis. Cupid designed to be an early game god mostly. Going into mid game, I would say he's still very solid and then falls off. So maybe just where Anhur is. He could also be placed a little more towards early, because the problem with Cupid very early is that he doesn't really have the clear, but shortly after that he gets a lot of bully potential. It depends a lot on who you're teamed with. Fafnir is a crazy late game god, and as such I will put him down here. He does have some mid game potential, but late game, when he gets his dragon form for longer and stuff like that, is where he really shines. Fenrir is among the early to mid gods, not quite as early as Arachne or Willish for that matter, because he wants to have his ultimate as well to be really, really effective in terms of aggression. Freya is late game, and she's very, very strong at that, very similar to Kronos at the moment. Then we have Geb. Geb also a very late game focused character with his shield and his ultimate, but a little more potential around level 12 as soon as he got blink. Could be in the middle between both as well. I put him into late game for now. Guan Yu, kind of an all-rounder, I would say. You got that early aggression, but at the same time you got that late game healing, so doesn't really have a weak curve in any place. Hades is hard. Hades actually has a lot of lane bully potential, but he also has a lot of teamfight setup and stuff like that. I do think he's a little bit weaker at certain stages, like towards mid game when he cannot bully out as much anymore, and then becomes better again in like real team fights. But as such, I would put him into all stages because they can't differ that much. Habois needs some farm to get in line and have his potential. Has some bully potential in lane though, so. I would say he can be strong at all stages, and he's very much a late game character in that sense. But he's also not necessarily weak. Maybe just pair him with Hades. Maybe he's kind of the same thing in a way. Hell is absolutely late game, as pretty much all healers that we see here except for Guan. You just need that farm to be really good. Hercules is an early game aggression character, even though he doesn't see much play at the moment. Early on, Hercules can punish you for misplays very, very hard, and the longer the game goes, less that's the case. He could also be here with Anhur and Fenrir, but I will just put him into early because I think he's really more of an early character overall. Hou Yi does now, with his new change, not see too much benefit out of being max level on his 2 anymore compared to before. So it's kind of a bit hard to place him. I would say he's got a solid laning phase, and he's still got a solid late game phase, so basically all stages. Hun Batz is one that works in the later stages, but he can also do very unexpected damage with lucky crits around mid game already, so I would say mid game to late game is very, very fitting for him. Isis has that early aggression, does not really fall off all that hard, but I would say early to mid game is her strongest place still, with the ultimate being a very good game changer in late game. Janus is probably strong in any stage, really. His ultimate allows him for so much. As soon as he hits level 5, he's good, basically. Jing Wei is strong in the lane phase because she can come back, but she doesn't have the biggest trade potential. The longer the game goes, the better for her, basically. She can do all her split push shenanigans. She can get that crit that she needs so desperately. And as such, I would say she's not quite as late game as Artemis, maybe between mid and late game. Kali, late game, no discussion about that one. Khepri, more of an all-rounder. Not the best bully potential in lane, but also definitely not the worst with his protection strat and all that. And a very nice ultimate for teamfights. So I would say, overall, going across the game. Kukulkan. Kukulkan needs a lot of stacks to be really effective. He needs a lot of farm to be really effective. And as such, I will just put him into late game. That's where he is actually successful. Before that, he just sits on the tower and does nothing. Kumbhakarna. Kumbhakarna is probably an all-rounder because he's mostly focused on his CC. His CC gets stronger over time, a little bit at least. And as such, I think he's good for the lane bully with his minion clear and then transitions into a CC monster. Loki. Loki is definitely not an early game god. I'm not quite sure if Loki really... Like, he can shine in mid, depending on the situation, similar to Ao Kuang. But it's a little less likely, I would say. Late game, on the other hand, he's only a split pusher and a team fighter, so... complicated one. I will give him the benefit of the doubt and put him between the two categories here. I'm not sure why this just shifted. We'll just see if we can readjust that real quick. Hold on. That's annoying. Yep, we can though. Cool. And now we're moving on. Oh, it's because we had some gods disappearing. Medusa. Medusa, I would say mostly a mid-game character. Doesn't have the best bully early, doesn't have the best late-game potential out of the hunters. So mid-game is where she sits very, very nicely. Mercury. Mercury is a late-game character, and as such, I wouldn't even say there's too much debate about it. He's doing fine in mid-game, but late-game is where he's really, really good. Neith is an early-game hunter with all that early-game aggression and falls off harder than other hunters by far. Nemesis used to be a late-game character, is now a mid to late-game character because her ultimate is a lot more effective in earlier stages than it used to be. Ne Zha. Ne Zha is a hard one. I would say he's got early aggression, but he's also got that late-game pick potential. So maybe he's just with the others that go throughout all stages. Nox needs a while to become effective. Suffers from the fact that a lot of people then can get second relics on level 12, and if they didn't get beats before, they will definitely be able to do that then. Maybe a mid-tier god by most of the logic. But she has a good late game as well, don't get me wrong, but I think mid-game is where she really does what she does without being interrupted all too often. Nuwa, once again, the longer the game goes, the better she gets, so I would put her into late game. Odin, definitely an early game warrior, along with the other two here. That's actually quite fitting. They're all in that category. Osiris, more leaning towards early to mid game bully potential. Then late game, he's still very decent in certain comps, but not as crazy anymore. Not entirely sure. I think I'll just place him here between the two, from early to mid game. Poseidon. Poseidon, I think, is a typical mid game character. He's still good late game, don't get me wrong, but eventually hunters just outtrade him. And his early game isn't the best, but it's also not bad. But then mid game, this is where he does his stuff the best. Ra has very early reliable clear. He's not much of a bully. He has to sit under his tower a lot because of having no escapes. But then transitions into a team healer, and I would say his early is not too bad, but also not that great, and as such, I will put him between mid game and late game, as those are the stages where he's even better. Raijin is good early, Raijin is good mid, Raijin is good late, Raijin is good in all stages. Ram used to be more of a late game focused god, but with his slow buff and all that, I would say he could even be good at all stages. For the sake of where he's strongest, I would still say that is between middle and late, and we will put him here. Red Tusker is pretty good early, Red Tusker is pretty good mid, and Red Tusker is decent late. So that's an all stages god. Raven is one of those early game bullies once again, and that's where he belongs. He's still good in other stages, still good towards middle game, but early is where he's just brutal. Scylla is a late game god, and there is no doubt about that. With the removal of Red Pot, that's a lot more obvious again than it used to be in between. Serket is a mid game god. She needs her ultimate to be effective, and she does best in mid game where there's not too much, like around the time where she gets her crit online, basically. That's where she's best, and there's not too much protection against it. Late game, that doesn't work quite as well anymore, and she has to rely more on her ultimate, and she's not the best team fighter unless her ultimate spreads, but she's still good overall, but mid game is just where she is at. Skadi, I don't really know, because Skadi is so dependent on the matchup that I would just say all stages, depending on how you play her and when you play her and whatnot. It's really complicated to just specify that in her case. Sobek has that early aggression and falls off towards late game. I would say his middle game, yes, is still relatively good, so I would put him between early and mid game. Sol is more of a late game character with the potential to push structures very, very fast, have a decent impact on team fights, maybe somewhere between mid game and late game, but I'll put it with the other ones that are exactly between it. San Wukong, more of a early bully, but then also a very good teamfight character with his knock-up and his general utility. Very underrated by me for a very long time. So I guess he's just going into the all stages category. Susano's best between early and mid game. That's where he is the most potent, getting some abilities off relatively quickly and dealing a huge amount of damage. He's already really good in early, and then he stays good until mid game. Late game he's still okay, but not as great as before. Sylvanos is probably best early. Early in lane he is such a bully when it comes to Guardians that not many can compete with him, and then he gradually falls off a little bit. Thanatos, early game. That's how he's designed, that's all. Thor, good in all stages, just differently. Early on, it's all about the burst damage. It's all about getting as much damage off as possible. Later on, it's more about teamfight, utility, and all that. Tur is, I would say, mostly a mid-game god. He's got a decent enough late game. As early is okay, but he needs some points in his abilities to come online. He needs some extra healing. He needs that reliable instant clear of the wave so he can really bully you. And as such, I would say mid-game god. Ullr, I would say, is relatively good throughout all stages now. Not really any spikes. Falls off a little bit late game, but not enough for me to say he would be weak in that regard. Because if he can hit you with his combo late game, you're still pretty much dead meat if you're another hunter. So, hey. Vamana gets stronger the later the game goes mostly. But he hits a dip at a certain point. So I would just say I put him here with the remark that he can, depending on the build, fall off a little bit. Vulcan, very good early on now, surprisingly actually, but also very good mid and late. Yeah, it's all stages actually. Xbalanque, late game, no discussion. Xingtian, with the recent buff, interesting thoughts there. Overall, he's pretty much decent anyway. He's not gonna bully anyone in lane early on. He's not gonna be the one who bullies San Wukong out of lane most of the time. But he's also not gonna get bullied out. He's just gonna sustain and then eventually be effective enough. I would just put him between mid game and late game. Ymir has a lot of early aggression, a lot of mid game potential. Late game he's still decent with the wall setup and stuff, but I would say he's not the best late game support. So we just put them between early and mid game. Zeus, Zeus, as long as he doesn't get focused, Zeus stays relevant. Strong early, strong mid, strong late. And Shongurs, Xiongqui, very much a late game character. The more farm he has, the more effective he can use his ultimate without dying. And that's where we put him. And that's all. So this is a rough overview of how strong certain gods are at certain stages of the game. Like I said, with some it's not that easy. With some you have to keep in mind that they kind of function differently in different stages and therefore may perform a little better or worse. This is definitely not something that's set in stone. Patches can really change a lot about the power curves of certain characters here, as we have seen in the past, especially those who are effective across all stages or those who are not. And I think this should give you good enough of an overview to form your own opinion. I hope this was interesting. I hope this was helpful. Thank you guys for watching. A new video tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.